Okay, so you have now heard two different songs from T-Rex, Electric Warrior. And did you guys know that this is T-Rex's fifth album, but it could also be considered their first album?
I did not know that.
I did glance at their discography and see that they have it up there.
Well, do you wanted the numbers, John?
I would love to hear the numbers, Matt.
All
Thanks
right.
for
So
reminding me.
for best ever albums, this album, Electric Warrior, clocks in at number 87 in the 1970s, 16 in 1971, and 337 overall. And then in Rolling Stone's list, it came in at number 188. So fairly high with Rolling Stone.
Yeah, very high.
So it showed up in all of the... I always like the albums that show up in all of the charts because it seems that those are consensus. There's great albums all across the board, but this is one of those that's considered pretty much, I think, in all mediums consensus.
Now, I wrote the intro model, not the monologue, the intro to the show. My research said that I saw that it was the sixth album from T-Rex.
It is the.
That's what Wikipedia told me.
I have it as the fifth album, but I'll do a little bit of homework along the way. But let me go backwards into my original teaser here, guys, because we got a little bit off track. The reason that this may be considered the first album from T-Rex is because the band was originally known as Tyrannosaurus Rex. So when you search for T-Rex, for example, in Spotify, it looks as if Electric Warrior is their first album. And the reason that is because it is the first album under the T-Rex name. And we're going to talk a little bit about the transition from T-Rex to Tyrannosaurus Rex here in a second.
Didn't they, wait. Didn't they have an album before? They have a T-Rex album that came out in 1970 where they were T-Rex.
A T-Rex album in 1970? Mm-hmm. I apologize.
Again, that's what Wikipedia is telling me. I don't know if it says that was 1970 and then this one was from 71.
Well, we'll fact check that right now.
We'll have to
I just did.
So let's go. Okay, we've gone way off the rails right here. I'm gonna have to go back and fucking explain why this band changed names in a second. But all right, whether it's their fourth or fifth album, there is a major transition, and we'll go back and do it. So let's go into the early period of T-Rex right here and go backwards. All right, and then we'll figure out if it's the fourth or the fifth album. Needless to say, it is their most famous album, and it's their most critically acclaimed album. So we can agree on that. So T-Rex was formed in England in 1967 and was the brainchild of guitarist and songwriter Mark Bolan. So Mark Bolan was previously in a band known as John's Children, which lasted only 4 months before he decided to found Tyrannosaurus Rex, the original name of the band. The original band was a 4-piece lineup, and sort of the mythology of that group was that they were auditioning members for the group all the way up until their first show. I want you guys to guess how many shows the original 4-piece lineup of Tyrannosaurus Rex played before they broke up.
0.
Josh, take a guess. Matt's guessing 0. Josh, how many do you think they did?
5.
5. Well, it was 1. They did one performance that did not go very well, and it went so poorly that Bolan went back to the drawing board, and he decided to change the band from a 4-piece group into a 2-piece duo with a gentleman by the name of Steve Took. Okay? The first 4 albums, and I know these 4 albums for a fact, so if this magic 5th album was there, I apologize. It would be under the T-Rex name, not Tyrannosaurus Rex name. The first 4 albums were all considered to be psychedelic folk albums, so very, very different sound. I went back and listened, combed the stacks, if you will, to the earlier albums, and it is very difficult to process the band as the same band outside of a little bit of what Mark Bolan sounds like singing. The rest of it, though, sounds like a completely different band because it basically was a different band. And around 1969, there was a sort of a mess between the two halves of Tyrannosaurus Rex. Bolan at that time was kind of living a relatively domesticated life with his girlfriend, relatively in check. And Steve Took, on the other hand, kind of went full in late 60s, right? He basically was all in on drugs, all in on free living, and kind of doing the thing in the English underground, which, when described in the articles that I was reading, kind of sounded like San Francisco, but if it was in England. That's kind of how the psychedelic folk world of England was going. He eventually even looked at Iggy Pop and the Stooges back in 1969, so we're talking early Iggy Pop and the Stooges, as an influence. And pretty much by the time 1969 happens, they realize it isn't going to happen. But they were booked on a U.S. tour. So they actually, while they were in the process of pretty much breaking up, they went on a U.S. tour that was pretty notably a disaster as well. It was around this time that Bolan sort of decided he wanted to go away from folk, the psychedelic folk type sound, and he wanted to pursue electric rock, plugged in electric guitar rock. He also decided to change the name from Tyrannosaurus Rex to T-Rex, and he replaced Steve Took with Mickey Finn, a percussionist who would be a part of the band that would also be part of the classic lineup of this version of T-Rex. So he's on Electric Warrior.
Was that that Took guy in the original band that only performed once? Was he an original member, or is he a totally new guy after Bolan kicked everybody else out?
That's a great question. He was in the original band. Yep.
Okay.
It was the two of them, and they broke off, correct. So one interesting notable thing about the new T-Rex that we're going to talk about was that the lineup, the new lineup that we're going to talk about in a second, was the first ever act to headline the Glastonbury Festival in 1970, the very first Glastonbury Festival. Cool. Yep. So there's that. So
I didn't know it was that old.
Yeah, that was the first. I was surprised by that. I wasn't sure when it started, but yeah, 1970 was the first one, and the first headliner was T-Rex. So Bolan goes and recruits a bassist by the name of Steve Curie and a drummer by the name of Bill Legend. And you may be saying, wait, a drummer? I thought Mickey Finn was a percussionist. You said, John, you are correct. They had a percussionist and a drummer. So drummer Bill, once again, another great name, drummer Bill Legend is there to go along with the vocals and the guitar of Bolan as well. So they pretty much make this change. And one thing to know about T-Rex is, boy, were they popular in Britain between 1970 and 1973. They were so popular, guys, that their fandom was actually called T-Rextasy. Because they were, that's a true story, because they were actually at almost like Beatlemania level of popularity. Wow. And if you don't believe it, they had 11 top 10 singles on the British charts between 1970 and 1973, including 4 number 1 hits. Their albums during this time were all in the top 10, and Electric Warrior, which we're covering today, was number 1. So they were an incredibly popular and influential band in Britain. They also are considered to be one of the pioneers of glam rock. Remember, this album's from 1971, and the switch over to T-Rex was 1970. So this predates David Bowie, who many people think of as glam rock, by a good 2 years, because Ziggy Stardust was a 1972 album. And Mark Bolan and David Bowie, as you might imagine, did overlap at different times, which I'm sure we'll talk about on the Ziggy Stardust album when we get there. So they're a huge band. A thing to know is that in the change from the psychedelic folk sound, they also became more overtly racy in terms of their lyrical content. The lyrics tended to focus on overt sexuality, kind of tongue-in-cheek. And as you might imagine, guys, this new sound was really disliked by the old school, more hippie style of fans of the group. I did a lot of research on this because I found the context pretty interesting. But my favorite was when they said the lyrics went from poetic and surrealistic in the earlier version of Tyrannosaurus Rex to sensuous with orgasmic moans and innuendo in the T-Rex version of it, which I thought was a good way to describe it.
John, did you like you mentioned briefly like the old the folk albums? Are those decent at all? I know they're different, but did you like them?
We would not be talking about them on Combing the Stacks if they did not become T-Rex. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So, yeah. I imagine if that's your genre, you may like it, but I don't think it will have anywhere near the wide appeal that this version of T-Rex had. So, but hey, if all else fails, go check out Tyrannosaurus Rex, listen to a couple of clips, and see what you think. Maybe I'll try and Cleaning the Stacks next week to give some more context on that era of T-Rex if you're interested. So T-Rex was sort of a cult act in the United States. They were not as popular in the United States. Now, Bang a Gong, Get It On was a top 10 song on the U.S. charts. The reason it was called Bang Gong Get It On instead of Get It On was to distinguish from another Get It On song that was popular at the time as well. So you got to get the mood in the early 70s there, that there were too many Get It On songs, in the charts. Confusing. So a little bit of context. This is the last time we're going to be covering T-Rex. They eventually leave Fly Records after this album, which was their British record label, and go to EMI, where Bolan is given his own record label, T-Rex Records. Warner Brothers was their U.S. record label, for context. As soon as their popularity came, 1970, 1973, it kind of wanes by 1974, and they really don't have a hit after that. Bolan kind of pivoted into doing some R&B and disco stuff, trying to replicate getting ahead of the curve with the electric guitar, but it did not hit as well. Legend leaves the group in 1974. They decide to add both a steel pedal guitarist and a second guitarist, and their longtime producer, who, going back to the Tyrannosaurus Rex days and these albums from 70 to 73, by the name of Tony Visconti, left the group as well. Bolan, it's an interesting run from about 1974 to 1977, which was the time of his death. He kind of goes through a bad period from 74 to 76, where I found this funny. He left the UK due to high tax rates, which in the 70s and 80s was a big deal in Europe. People dodging taxes. It kind of was, reported often in the news because it was considered to be socially stigmatic. And he decides to duck the taxes in the UK by moving to the United States. And if you're trying to dodge high tax rates, guys, in the United States, where would you move?
Not the United States.
well,
dodging. I would go to Florida.
Yeah, you would, wouldn't you? Would you go to California like Mark Bolan did? No, you wouldn't. But that should go to show you how things changed, doesn't it? Because he looked at California as the place to go to avoid UK tax rates. He was a vegetarian and he stopped, and he's described as largely subsisting on hamburgers and booze during this time, and put on quite a bit of weight. It's actually remarkable to kind of see the pictures of him. He's going through some things, let's put it that way, a little bit. But the good news is by 1977, Bolan had largely cleaned up and was starting to tour. In fact, the last tour he was on was headlined by the famous punk group The Damned. I don't know how familiar you guys are with The Damned, but really solid group that I think we talk about later as well. Sadly, actually, Bolan dies in 1977 in a car crash, just 2 weeks shy of his 30th birthday. His longtime girlfriend and a member of the group as of 1974, Grace Jones, who's kind of known for singing the original Tainted Love, was the driver and survived the wreck. So actually he was not the driver, he was a passenger, but he passed away, and his girlfriend was the driver, and she did survive. That ended the band, because T-Rex without Bolan was kind of not a thing. They did try to bring back T-Rex at different times over the next years, but it was not kind of received, because without Mark Bolan, it's not really.
It's like Nine Inch Nails without Trent Reznor.
Yeah, it's not the same thing, right? So Finn actually passed away in 2003. Bill Legend is still alive. Believe it or not, and I thought this was fake at first, but it was real. He died in 1980 after choking on a cocktail cherry. Wow. He asphyxiated.
Whoa.
Yes. So, I mean, rock and roll life is crazy, but boy, that, because, there's that story like Mama Cass, right? They say she died choking, but she didn't. You know what I mean? She was a heart attack. Yeah. So I thought, okay, this has to be apocryphal, but nope. Everybody everywhere pretty much confirms that it was. So I don't know what was going on there, but that definitely is one of the more unusual stories there. So rest in peace to all of the members of T-Rex. The band was actually recently inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2020, and much like Iggy and the Stooges, and it seems like every group I cover each week, they're just incredibly covered. They're one of the most covered acts ever. The New York Dolls, the Ramones, R.E.M., the Smiths, the Replacements, the Pixies, and Joy Division all have either covered or listed the band as one of their great influences. So a little bit longer of a biography than I normally do, so I apologize for that. I'm normally the short bio guy, but I did think this one was interesting, and it's our only time covering them, so I went a little bit along, but I'll stop there. Let's start with you, Josh. What were your thoughts? I know you've said before that you like T-Rex, so was it confirmed again as you listened to this album?
Oh yeah, this album is great. I feel like T-Rex is, based on that bio, they burned bright and they burned hard, and I feel like they've left such a lasting impact on the music scene. I mean, there'd be no hair metal, there'd be no Guns N' Roses without Mark Bolan and T-Rex, in my opinion, and all the later bands that were influenced by those bands. I love you really described them perfectly. I love kind of the implied sexuality in these songs, and I love Bolan's voice and what he does by adding little things in the same way that kind of David Lee Roth does, but his are much more like lower and kind of on the ends of words, and sometimes miss them. Those like growls and grunts and, you know, sexual sounds. I love
orgasmic moans, as they said in the one thing I described. Yes,
moans, good.
Mm-hmm.
They write really good hooks on these songs. They're Jeepster and Bang a Gong are so catchy and danceable. And Motivator too was another one that was in that vein. And I love just they seemed to be unafraid to, you know, they bring in different instruments at times, such as like horns. I think they bring some strings in at one point, and they just seem to, despite the repeating nature of structure of their songs, they just have a good beat and they go with it, and they are creating really danceable, great rock music. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So yeah, they were great. I have heard this album before, but I hadn't heard it in a while. I really liked, as I said, Jeepster and Bang a Gong are the great hits off of this. I also liked Motivator, and I liked Planet Queen is a pretty funny song too. I think they still keep some of that psychedelic out there references and allusions in that. I heard that in the lyrics. They reference Doctor Strange in their first song, Mambo Son, so they were clearly reading comics in the 70s from Marvel. But yeah, they're just great. I think I could see why somebody might not like them as much due to kind of the repeating nature. They're not really differentiating within the songs too much, but it doesn't bother me at all, and I really liked it.
There you go. Well, what do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I like this a lot too. Actually, I the only song I knew on here was Bang a Gong, Get It On, whatever. Mm-hmm. And I knew that from I knew that as no gong. Yeah. There's sadly no gong, but happily no electric jug, Josh. So we don't have to worry about that. I knew that song as a Power Station song. Do you guys remember Power Station in the 80s?
No. What is that?
I do know Power Station. I don't know that song primarily as a Power Station song, though.
That was aside from Some Like It Hot. That was a single. It might have been. I loved that song as a kid, and then I didn't realize that for years I thought it was the Power Station was a supergroup in the 80s. Josh had John. Do you remember who's in it?
Buster Poindexter, right? Wasn't he in it?
No.
Kind
of. You're in the same line though. It's it's Robert Palmer.
Robert Palmer, yes.
Mm-hmm. And then the two dudes from Duran Duran, the bass player
Simon Le Bon.
No. John Taylor and Andy Taylor.
Yeah, okay.
And Andy Taylor, the guitarist and bassist, and then the drummer from Chic, who I don't know his name. It's just like a random. Yeah. So anyway,
if you had said Nile Rodgers from Chic or Simon Le Bon from Duran, you know what I mean? Like it's like all of the other dudes in the bands. Yeah.
Simon Le Bon was doing Arcadia. I don't know what Nile Rodgers was doing, but anyway,
something good, I'm sure, and it probably wasn't available for that project.
Well, anyway, so I knew that song there, and was surprised years later to be like, holy cow, I didn't know that was a cover, and so I've obviously really liked that song for a long time. Really like this album. This is Bowie all over it. I mean, there's so many songs on here that you can just tell how Bowie must have heard this and was like, all right, I'm kind of I'm going to go in that direction, for sure. Particularly like the slower kind of songs like Cosmic Dancer, like Monolith. They kind of Life's a Gas, very Bowie kind of sounding song. But I liked how they interspersed like a faster, more upbeat song with a slower song. You're right, Josh. Like there's within those two different genres or types of sounds, there is a lot of similarity, but it's all good. There's really good hooks. It's catchy. The instrumentation's very interesting because it's very staccato. It's very he doesn't hold out his guitar. You know, he doesn't it's not a riff heavy thing. It's very staccato. It's very short, stops, and it just goes on doot doot doot, you know, that type of thing. Along with it's almost like another percussion instrument. The way he's playing guitar. Rip Off is kind of like an outlier. That's like a harder, you know, type song. That ends the album.
It's
and
heavy.
Yeah, that's certainly a standout song. Is like, wow, that's different than anything that he's done. And I didn't like that as much. Well, I think for a while, for the first couple of days, I was like, it's easily my least favorite song on the album. And the more I listened to it, the more I liked it, particularly the bridge of that song. So it's got some horns in it. You know, he's definitely getting a little bit, I don't know if I would say experimental, but he's definitely branching out with that. But there's a lot of orchestration in here that kind of complements some of the songs nicely. And it's just a really solid album. I wouldn't say that I love it, but I really did like it. And I'm glad I learned about all these, you know, more of these songs. I did know a little bit about the history and Mark Bolan, because I did see they were inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame like a couple years ago. And so I saw
last year. 2020.
Yeah, so so I got to see that and stuff, and I also found out that he was good friends with Ringo. Like Ringo did a lot of stuff with Mark Bolan in the later years, which I found I didn't know about. But very good album. It's too bad we're not covering more because they have a ton of records, and the fact that they have all these hits and stuff like that, this is something I might have to go rogue on a little bit and try to, you know, listen to some other stuff. But pretty big thumbs up here. Really did like this record.
Yeah, so I think that while they don't sound the same necessarily, I think T-Rex is very similar to the Stooges in the sense that when you hear them, you hear like the next 15 to 20 years in music. Mm-hmm. And I think, as you mentioned, Matt, like right after this album, T-Rex comes out, you get like David Bowie creating Ziggy Stardust. And then you have a whole bunch of acts in like 72 through 74. I don't know how familiar you are with acts like Sweet, right, and Mott the Hoople and Slade and all those acts, right, you know, and the New York Dolls Josh earlier said without T-Rex there's not Guns N' Roses. I used to always say like the Guns N' Roses came from like the New York Dolls, right, is where they came from. But and then not only that, but you have all the acts like Elton John and Rod Stewart, right, who took on bits of this. Kiss, heavily influenced by this with stage presence. All of that new romantic music that is going to end up on the stacks at the end of the 70s, like, like Brian Ferry and Adam and the Ants and stuff like that. All of that comes from even Queen, when you think about it, is kind of.
I can see that.
And then you got all those 80s acts that kind of go off this, like, you know, the Ambiguity and Flock of Seagulls type video-y type stuff. and you know, the pretty guy hair metal, you know, like all the stuff Matt loves, you know, Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, Twisted Sister, all that stuff. All of that you can see pieces of coming from this T-Rex album and what Mark Bolan did. So I think when I was listening to this album, it was almost impossible for me not to think of it as sort of a prescient look at where music was going in the 70s. And, you know, I talked last week about, in the bonus episode, about which albums sound like 70s albums. And here you go. Here's, like, more so than any album, the first album that's like, this is a 70s album that shapes the 70s, which is kind of like what I like looking at the start of a decade. Because let's be honest, guys, in the 60s, we didn't get many albums from the beginning of the 60s. No. Really, we were looking at like 1965 kind of as what 1970 is for this decade. So that's my takeaway. This was a heavier album than I thought it would be. I'm familiar with T-Rex. I hadn't listened to Electric Warrior in years, so I think I was caught off guard at just how heavy the album was at times. I mean, it's not like, you know, Black Sabbath heavy, but like Matt mentioned, Rip Off has a real heavy guitar part. You know, Lean Woman Blues has a really cool, slightly heavy guitar part. The Motivator has interesting guitar in it, and what I love is I even love the song Life's a Gas, which is such a curveball in there that's kind of goofy. And, you know, as I mentioned before, the lyrics, it's I think Bolan describes his lyrics kind of as not to be taken too seriously, kind of, and there's a ton of innuendo all throughout this album. You wonder if he's just sort of like pressing the limits just to press the limits, but you never get the you never get the idea that he's too literal on anything, but you also get the idea that he may be literal every once in a while, which is what makes the songs kind of funny, because you don't know what's what at times. But very much ahead of its time. As an album itself, I would say, relatively solid recommend. Do I feel that it's at the tippy top of the albums we've listened to so far? No. But is it an album that I could easily see myself revisit? For sure. And I mean, like I said, if you're familiar with any of those acts that I mentioned afterwards, especially Bowie, the New York Dolls, Sweet, like all the groups in the aftermath. And, it's interesting because some of them we cover and some of them we don't. But to me, they're all kind of part of the same genre. So, well worth listening to, and certainly worth listening to from a historical standpoint to get an idea of where a lot of music, especially music in big cities in the United States and Great Britain, was going. Because the influence on British rock in particular was massive.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I heard this listen to is that they do some interesting guitar stuff in the background when Bolan's singing. They often do little tangents or kind of just little unexpected.
Well, and that's him, because he's the guitarist, and there's only another bassist. Yeah,
so he's doing it then. Yeah, and I appreciated that this go around.
Yeah, Lean Woodman Blues, that's another good thing, that along with Ripoff, because I would say that's a straight up blues song, and I can't say that about really any of the other songs on here, but he's kind of doing just a straight up take on a blues song. And
I said it was heavy, and it's not heavy. It's bluesy. Would be a better description.
Right. It's a very standard blues song, but that one I would say in addition to Ripoff, but the other ones it's almost like two different variations of the same thing, but it's all really done well. I liked it a lot. Is there any? I know we talked about the lyrics and and just the glam rock scene and flamboyance and everything that came with it. Was there any was he sexually ambiguous, or was he because I think he had a son. I know he had
he always was
wife.
He always was dating women in terms of when you read his bios and stuff. So I interestingly enough, for a guy who was kind of writing these type of sexually charged songs, he's usually described as sort of more of in his early days in particular, he's described as kind of relatively low key. And even during his indulgent / off the rail days, it's more booze and food, and eccentric behavior than it is, heavy drug use and stuff like that that's described often. And like I said, his death had nothing to do with drugs. I mean, he'd been drinking that night, but he was not driving. So he was the passenger in the car. So as decadent lifestyles go. But, keep it Kiss, right? We're sober. No one wrote more raunchy sex songs than Kiss, right? And they were notoriously sober. So can't judge a book by its cover, I guess.
Anything, John, that you read about what their stage act or presence was like? I can imagine him strutting around on
it's that glam and ambiguous. If you see pictures of him, he's the template for Ziggy Stardust, right? And he's, when you think of those, I always think of those AM radio commercials they'd play for the AM Time Gold. Life. It's the 70s AM Gold, and half of it was these saccharine songs, Bay City Rollers and stuff, it's Saturday night, that crap, that stuff. And then the other part was there was glam rock stuff. So you had Ballroom Blitz by Sweet, Bang a Gong by T-Rex, different stuff like that. And if you see those video clips and stuff where they're in kind of the cut open, not a unitard, but the cut open top that's almost tights and big spangly jackets and glittery stuff that would come later. That's kind of what T-Rex looked like on stage. So I guess what would later be sort of taken in a ambiguous direction, when they were doing it, it was more showy, I guess. Think maybe more kind of what, like I said, I don't know how much you guys know the New York Dolls, but kind of what the New York Dolls and Kiss did with it, as opposed to David Bowie and the stuff where it became real sexually ambiguous. You know what I mean? Before it was sort of staged. Alice Cooper is another person who kind of wasn't glam rock, but it didn't have the ambiguity necessarily. T-Rex was kind of in the middle of what Alice Cooper was doing and what David Bowie would later do. Yeah.
All right. So it sounds positive from all three of us.
Yeah,
varying degrees.
I would say for me, for sure.
I'm down.
That's good to know, Matt. I know the audience takes your recommendation very seriously, so
I'm down with the Rex. Did anybody call them the Rex?
I don't.
I'm gonna call them the Rex. No.
I
could start it.
You can, you can coin that some 40 years later. Yeah, so, yeah, or 50 years almost, right? 50. Jesus,
that's what they're going to start. That's
later,
that's what they're going to start calling it in South Africa. So
South Africa. Yeah. God bless those folks if they ever listen to you for their advice on taste. So.